thank you to Pia for organizing this and for inviting me to participate. And thank you to everyone here for taking your time out to come to this. Pia asked me to summarize a 200-page book in 20 minutes. So I'm just, every 20 pages I'll say something. So what I want to do is just kind of give you a little bit of an overview of the book, and then we're going to have kind of a conversation back behind the screen. And what got me interested in this topic to begin with, as Pia mentioned, I had been doing research and writing on the marriage debate, how to properly understand what marriage is, which then gave rise to research and writing about a religious liberty discussion, and the op-ed in tomorrow's Wall Street Journal is on the Masterpiece Cake Shop and how to think about what the Supreme Court did earlier this week. And then that gave rise to a discussion about gender identity. Because as a political matter, as soon as the activists who were trying to redefine marriage, as soon as they were successful, they pivoted from the LGB part of the acronym to the T part of the acronym. And most Americans didn't have time to really stop and think about what's going on. And so I work at a think tank in DC that deals with public policy. So many of the requests we were getting was, how should we think about bathrooms or locker rooms when there were debates about bathroom bills? What should we think about military service? What should we think about religious liberty? There are 2 Catholic hospitals that are being sued right now because they don't perform sex reassignment surgeries. And the government is, they're being accused of discrimination. Right? So the last chapter of the book deals with all the public policy issues. And that's at the end intentionally, because while that was where I started thinking about these issues, it's actually the least important part of the discussion. The most important part of the discussion are the people, the human lives that may or may not flourish based upon what they believe to be true about human nature. And while I was researching into particular topics on public policy, I came across a number of individuals who had transitioned, thinking it would provide them with the wholeness and the happiness that they were looking for, only to be left further disappointed. And then several years later, they detransitioned. And the stories that they tell, and several of them have now told their stories on YouTube videos and in blog posts, they're just heartbreaking. Because here were people who were largely the victims of the activists and the gender experts who say that the solution to gender dysphoria is a transition protocol, whether it's hormonal or surgical. And that's what got me convinced that I had to do an entire book on this topic. It wouldn't be enough just to do a white paper on a public policy matter for a think tank. This really needed to be a deeper dive. And so the first slide that I want to show you is just one quote. It comes from the 3rd chapter of the book. It's from one of the people who made a video, Carrie. She says, "I wanted to make a video previously so that folks can see that I'm a real live person, but didn't out of fear of showing my face. But I think it's important when we talk about these issues to really understand that women like us aren't just statistics, not just some dry data some gatekeeping doctor might throw at you. We're real people. This is a real outcome of transition. I'm a real live 22-year-old woman with a scarred chest and a broken voice and 5 o'clock shadow because I couldn't face the idea of growing up to be a woman. That's my reality." And so one of the questions for all of us is how many other people will one day have to say that this is their reality? And what can we do to try to prevent people from experiencing what Carrie has experienced? And I should point out that many of the people who transitioned and then detransitioned, they express regret at the medical doctors who transitioned them, saying that they were too young to be making these decisions, especially the ones who started going on testosterone when they were still in high school. They regret their lost fertility, they regret the damage they've done to their bodies, but they also criticize people like us. And what I mean by that is that they say that many people within kind of the conservative Catholic or evangelical or religious right world stigmatize people like them. And they're overly rigid in their gender stereotypes and gender expectations. And so it can make life more difficult for someone who's struggling with their gender identity. And I mention that as a caution so that we can be careful not to do anything that would make life worse for someone who's suffering in this way. And it's an important caution. So with that kind of framing, let me start by saying a couple of things from the earlier chapters in the book. The third chapter is where we hear about the detransitioners. The eighth chapter is where we deal with the public policy. The first two chapters are just on what the activists are saying. And what's important to understand here is that this is fundamentally a debate about human nature, and it's about anthropology. It's about a vision of the human person. And this shouldn't be surprising. John Paul II told us that the crisis of the 20th century was a crisis of faulty anthropology, political regimes that were getting human nature wrong. Something similar is going on here. The only difference is that while these are philosophical claims about human nature, they're not being made by philosophers and theologians, because in our culture, the high priests aren't the philosophers and the theologians, they're the doctors and the scientists. So what you'll see is it's people who have an MD after their name, using the authority of science, but making a fundamentally philosophical claim about human nature. So in the next slide, you'll see a statement that a doctor at Duke University's gender clinic, adolescent and child gender clinic, made to a federal court. So she's giving expert testimony to a federal court in North Carolina. She says, from a medical perspective, the appropriate determinant of sex is gender identity. It's counter to medical science to use chromosomes, hormones, internal reproductive organs, external genitalia, or secondary sex characteristics to override gender identity for purposes of classifying someone as male or female. Now that's just a remarkable statement. And this is the director of the child gender care clinic at Duke. So if you were a parent and your child was struggling with his or her gender identity, this would be the expert advice you would receive. And why it's staggering is that originally, just a generation ago, when the word gender was used to describe people instead of just being a grammatical term, gender was in distinction to sex. Sex was a bodily, biological reality, but gender was a social construct. Now Dr. Adkins was telling the court that gender identity determines the sex of the individual. Just a few years ago, chromosomes and hormones and internal reproductive organs and external genitalia and secondary sex characteristics were the bread and butter of medical science. And today, Dr. Adkins is telling a federal court that they're counter to medical science. These aren't scientific claims, these aren't medical claims. This is just a vision of the human person, a vision of anthropology that's being dressed up in scientific terms. And it gets worse because what here is taking place in a courtroom is also taking place in our nation's classrooms. So in the next slide, you'll see the genderbread person. The genderbread person is being used not just in American classrooms, but across the world. I was in Australia back in April, and this is being used in Australian classrooms. And what it's doing is it's catechizing children. It's catechizing children to think about their own body and their own identity according to these 5 spectrums. There's gender identity at the top, which is how you in your head define your gender, and you'll see 2 different arrows with 4 different boxes giving just a couple of, quote, infinite possibilities. Then there's gender expression, which is how you manifest your gender identity. Then there's biological sex, and at the bottom they have romantic attraction and sexual attraction. And none of those things have to necessarily line up with each other. Your gender identity could be one thing, your gender expression could be another, your biological sex a third, and then your romantic and your sexual attractions could differ as well. And you as a child need to figure out for yourself where you fall on this graphic, the various permutations and options. But the genderbread person got in trouble. The activists claimed that it wasn't politically correct, even though this is version 3.3. It's the most up-to-date version. First they said was that the genderbread person is supporting the patriarchy because it looks too much like a man. They said, who are we kidding? It's a gingerbread man. But then the second criticism was more substantive. They said it uses a politically incorrect term, biological sex. That's now politically incorrect. So in the next graphic, you'll see they corrected both of those mistakes. It's now sex assigned at birth, which is the new term of art, and it's now a unicorn. Doesn't look like a man or a woman. They unintentionally picked a mythical creature, which is surprisingly fitting for what they're promoting. But what's so subversive about the gender unicorn is that it's not meant to be appealing to you. The gender unicorn is not meant to change the minds of adults. It's meant to influence the thinking of children. This looks like Barney. This is meant to be attractive, colorful, capture the moral imagination of a child. And now what all of us do is we try to make sense of our lives. We try to make sense of our thoughts, our feelings, our experiences to help ourselves figure out where we're going and why. Now, imagine you're a young person and you're experiencing gender dysphoria. You don't feel comfortable in your own body. What do we do when we interpret our thoughts, our feelings, and our experiences? We interpret all of those things according to certain core convictions, according to certain fundamental beliefs. And so if you're experiencing a gender identity conflict, and your core conviction are the first couple of chapters of Genesis, that you're created male and female by a loving God, you might make sense of your thoughts and your feelings and your experiences one way. If your core conviction and your underlying assumptions are the gender unicorn, you might interpret your own thoughts and feelings and experiences in a different way. And so you can see what at first just looks utterly ridiculous can be rather subversive when used in a classroom to help shape the imagination and the thought process of a young person. The people who made this graphic explain why they used sex assigned at birth. So if you look at the next slide, you'll see they explain that biological sex is an ambiguous word that has no scale and no meaning, besides that it's related to some sex characteristics. It's also harmful to trans people. Instead, we prefer sex assigned at birth, which provides a more accurate description. The idea here is that your sex was merely assigned to you by a doctor at birth, and therefore a doctor later in life could reassign it. If your sex was misassigned at birth, it can be reassigned later. That's the substantive change that you see between the genderbread person and the gender unicorn. And that gives rise to the standard of medical care for children. It's a 4-part standard of care in which children as young as 3 are encouraged to socially transition with a new name and a new pronoun and a new wardrobe if they're persistent, insistent, and consistent that they're the opposite sex. And there have been several high-profile newspaper profiles of children who are transitioning at those young ages. The next step is puberty-blocking drugs to, quote, prevent a child from going through puberty in the wrong body. Then the third step is cross-sex hormones. They'll give testosterone to teenage girls, estrogen to teenage boys to try to mimic the puberty of the opposite sex, to masculinize or feminize their bodies. And then the fourth step is reassignment surgery, where they will remove various secondary sex characteristics and external genitalia and internal reproductive organs and try to recreate, using plastic surgery, something that resembles the opposite sexes. What to think about this? First thing to say is that sex reassignment surgery is impossible. You can't reassign what wasn't assigned in the first place. Our sexual identity isn't assigned to us at birth by a doctor. It's something that's determined at conception based upon physical realities. At conception, the chromosomes that we inherit from our mother and our father will give rise to the creation of certain sex organs, which will produce certain sex hormones, which will then masculinize or feminize our body in utero, which will then lead to the development of certain sexual reproductive systems with internal reproductive organs and external genitalia and then secondary sex characteristics. All of this taking place before we're born. So that when we are born, a doctor doesn't assign our sex to us, a doctor recognizes our sex. In fact, it doesn't require a doctor at birth. Most ultrasound technicians can do this at week 20. And again, it wasn't assigned at ultrasound. It was recognized. There's a reality, a physical reality, that physicians can recognize. This is why in the next slide you'll see, oh, actually, there was a slide that I skipped, but I'll mention this. But no, you can go back to this one. Just you'll see that the reason why they're doing this is that they say that peer-reviewed research shows that prepubertal children are cognitively capable enough to know that they could be the opposite sex. So all of you who have kids or grandkids who have experience with children, including children before the age of puberty, the doctor is saying that there's peer-reviewed research that shows that they're cognitively capable enough to know that they could be the opposite sex. Right? And that's why they're starting 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds on a social transition and then blocking puberty for 10, 11, and 12-year-olds, and then giving the opposite sex hormones to 14, 15, and 16-year-olds. And in the next slide, you'll see the director of mental health at the University of California in San Francisco. And you'll see that this quote, she even acknowledges that as children grow up, they might switch their gender identity, right? So she says that these children might be a boy-girl, or a gender hybrid, or gender ambidextrous, moving freely between genders. As they grow older, they might identify themselves as agender, or gender neutral, or gender queer. And then she says each of them is exercising their gender creativity. And yet in the very same breath, she recommends that parents place their children on puberty-blocking drugs and give them cross-sex hormones. So if the children's gender identity is fluid and changing and developing, why would you want to radically transform their bodies? Right? Why engage in that type of a procedure when even the trans-friendly activist doctor acknowledges that children are constantly developing in this respect? So with that, I can then say, I gotten ahead of myself, that the sex reassignment procedures don't work because there was nothing assigned in the first place that can later on be reassigned. And so in the next slide, you'll see that Dr. Lawrence Mayer at Johns Hopkins and at Arizona points out that let me get the right quote here. Scientifically speaking, transgender men are not biological men, and transgender women are not biological women. The claims to the contrary are not supported by a scintilla of scientific evidence. Or in the next slide, as Robert George at Princeton University puts it, changing sexes is a metaphysical impossibility because it's a physical impossibility. And so doctors are trying to do something that's impossible, and that also leads to the next conclusion, which is that this is why it frequently doesn't produce good outcomes. So Dr. Paul McHugh, he was the chair of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Medical School. He was the psychiatrist in chief at Johns Hopkins Hospital. In 1979, he shut down the Johns Hopkins Sex Reassignment Clinic. Hopkins had pioneered sex reassignment procedures back in the 60s. When they hired McHugh, he had been an undergraduate at Harvard and then Harvard Medical School. He then goes to Hopkins, he becomes psychiatrist in chief. He looks at what the long-term outcomes had been for those patients, and they didn't look pretty. And he said, we have people coming to us with a psychosocial struggle, and we're trying to treat it as if it's a physical problem. Hopkins reopened their sex reassignment clinic 2 years ago. 3 years ago, McHugh wrote an essay about Bruce Jenner. Bruce had just come out on the cover of Vanity Fair, was now going by Caitlin. And Dr. McHugh writes, transgender men do not become women, nor do transgender women become men. All become feminized men or masculinized women, counterfeits or impersonators of the sex with which they identify, and in that lies their problematic future. When the tumult and shouting dies, it proves not easy nor wise to live in a counterfeit sexual garb. The most thorough follow-up of sex reassigned people extending over 30 years and conducted in Sweden, where the culture is strongly supportive of the transgender, documents their lifelong mental unrest. 10 to 15 years after surgical reassignment, the suicide rate of those who had undergone reassignment surgery rose to 20 times that of comparable peers. And so what McHugh is pointing out here is that there was a patient population who presents themselves to physicians because they're struggling so much. Imagine how uncomfortable you would have to feel in your own body to contemplate having surgery to transition you to be the opposite sex. Right? These people are suffering. They're suffering with anxiety, with depression, frequently with substance abuse, alcohol abuse, suicide ideation. And then the surgery is not making things any better, and it might even be making things worse. Because as McHugh points out, it's not easy nor is it wise to try to live as if the opposite sex. So in the next slide, you'll see the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services under the Obama administration. This is their final report that they issued back in August of 2016, so not even 2 years ago. And they point out, while they were doing a literature review on whether or not they should mandate coverage for sex reassignment, that they point out that there were 6 studies that were actually useful. You'll see that in the middle of the quote. And of these, the 4 best studies that used quality of life before and after using validated metrics did not demonstrate clinically significant changes after GRS, gender reassignment surgery. So the Obama administration is pointing out that the best studies that have looked at this show that patients are suffering. They're suffering so much they'll have sex reassignment surgery, and then there's no clinically significant change afterwards. And they have all of the same struggles. And then the next slide, you'll see that they point to that same study that Dr. McHugh pointed to from Sweden. The mortality was primarily due to completed suicides, 19.1-fold greater than in control Swedes. And then over there, we note mortality from this patient population did not become apparent until after 10 years. So when you hear in the news, they'll say study after study showing how wonderful reassignment procedures are. Frequently, they're looking at 1 or 2 years afterwards. They're not using objective measurements, but they're using self-reports. They're not using control groups. They're not using any of the rigorous techniques. The best studies that they can look at don't show improvement, and some of them show worse outcomes that don't manifest themselves, in this case, until 10 years after the reassignment, which shows the difficulties. So let me wrap my portion up before we get to the kind of panel discussion, just by saying, what's the alternative? It's the middle sections of the books that deal with the philosophy and some of the science and the medicine outcomes. And then there's the 6th chapter just goes case study after case study after case study of a clinic in Toronto that was treating children with gender dysphoria. And what Dr. McHugh suggests is he draws an analogy to anorexia and to other body image problems. That we have people who don't feel comfortable in their own bodies for a variety of reasons. Sometimes an eating disorder or a body image problem has to do with how an individual views themselves. Sometimes it has to do with self-control issues. It has to do with esteem issues. There can be a variety of underlying causes. And therapists who work with high school girls, for example, with anorexia, try to identify what's the underlying cause here. But no therapist would ever prescribe for a high school girl with anorexia liposuction. No one would direct the therapy at the body. What they would try to do is line the thoughts and the feelings up with reality. And so McHugh suggests something very similar is true for gender dysphoria. You don't direct the therapy at the body because the problem's not with the body. And you don't try to do the impossible, which is transforming someone's body to line up a body with misguided thoughts and feelings. What you try to do, like all of psychotherapy, is line up the thoughts and the feelings with reality, including the reality of the body. And so some of those case studies would, I'll just mention one. There was a boy was identifying as a girl. His parents took him to see a therapist. And in simple talk therapy, the therapist saying to the boy, why do you think you're a girl? What about being a girl do you find attractive? What about being a boy do you find problematic and distressing? The boy revealed that he was being bullied. His classmates were picking on him. They were calling him a wuss and a sissy and a mama's boy because he wasn't very rambunctious. He wasn't kind of your stereotypical all-American boy. He was quieter, he was calmer, he was smaller, he wasn't as athletic. And most of his close friendships were now with the girls in his class. He's being picked on by the boys, his close friendships with the girls. His coping mechanism for the bullying was to identify as a girl. So the therapist suggested 3 things. 1, remove your son from this toxic environment. Right? If ever you could use a label of toxic masculinity, it would fit here. The bullying is one of the underlying causes of your son's gender dysphoria. Get him out of there. 2, keep bringing him to me each week so we can talk. Because contrary to what that doctor told the court, your son's not cognitively capable enough to know that he's actually a girl. Your son's been picked on. Your son is young and immature. He doesn't have a robust understanding of what it means to be a boy or to be a girl. He thinks all boys have to be jerks. We have to help him develop a more mature and nuanced understanding of sex and gender. And then 3rd, precisely because he's immature, he needs to experience this. It's not enough just to talk to him about it. So the 3rd step was find him a peer group. Find your son a group of friends who are boys just like him. Find him boys who share his interests, his proclivities, his temperament. Help him to see firsthand, experientially, that real boys can be just like him, and therefore he's a real boy. So after the parents did this, a year later, the son was identifying as a boy again. He was spared a lifetime of taking estrogen. He was spared from having to one day make a video like that quote that we saw from Carrie at the beginning. That's what I think our challenge is. Our challenge, especially in today's culture, is how can we be a force for the truth, be a force for good, helping people to understand what's going on underneath the surface, right? Not just focusing on a debate about bathrooms or a debate about religious liberty, but looking at the actual lives of people who are suffering and the human costs when we get human nature wrong. So with that, thank you. I think we're now going to turn it to a panel discussion, which I think will at some point include your questions. So be thinking about that.
I think you've done a tremendous service with this book. I've followed this issue for a long time. This is the first time that I've seen it all pulled together, particularly from the scientific side. Could you speak a little bit more to really how the science has been hijacked? Because I'm fascinated that Paul McHugh, he started this program at Johns Hopkins, then he sees that the outcomes are negative, yep. And he pulls the program. I'm fascinated that he was allowed to stay at Johns Hopkins after he cut a program. So I guess if I could ask you, it's a twofold question. Sure. One, just speaking more to the data, to the science, and then to Dr. McHugh's role in primary role in all of this.
So I'll answer them in reverse order, partly because it'll help answer the first one by taking the second one first. When McHugh tells the story about how he ended up convincing the colleagues to shut down the sex reassignment clinic, he reports that many of the surgeons were quite relieved by this. That if you're the actual doctor who's been kind of enlisted to do the surgery because some other doctors prescribed it, right? You go see a therapist, the therapist says, oh, you need gender reassignment surgery. I'm now making that referral, and you're now the surgeon who has to do it. And you kind of know from the physical perspective that this isn't actually doing what the patient is hoping for, because you can't actually reassign. You can make the cosmetic changes, as McHugh says, you can feminize a man's body or masculinize a woman's body. McHugh points out that lots of his surgery colleagues were relieved to no longer have to do this. McHugh's students and his other kind of colleagues in psychiatry, many of them agree with him, and they just lack the courage to say it out loud. The number of people in the acknowledgments of the book where I named some people by name, and then I was like, and there's a whole host of lawyers and professors and doctors who can't be named for fear of losing their jobs, right? And that gets to the, how has the science been hijacked, is the type of professional who specializes in gender care is someone who has strong convictions on these issues going into it, right? So if you major in gender studies in college and then you specialize in gender care at med school and then you do your residency and your internship, et cetera, and then you end up being the director of mental health at the University of California, San Francisco's pediatric gender clinic, you kind of had a set perspective on these things from the beginning. And it's in some of the slides that we cut out for tonight, it goes through some of the literature reviews on the science that just point out how poorly designed so many of the studies are, and that they were designed to reach a preordained conclusion, right? So they were trying to show that reassignment would be a good thing. And the honest researchers, when they look at this, they say, look, this doesn't use an objective measurement. It has a subjective endpoint cutoff. Why aren't you looking longitudinally? Why don't you have controls? It's as if you designed a study to try to show that transitioning would be good for people. And so they're not using rigorous methods, but it's a self-reinforcing group. The professional association WPATH, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, is a self-selective group. And so when other people, professors of endocrinology, professor of psychiatry, hear what's going on, they're very concerned. There's a professor of endocrinology at WashU who's written particularly on children. Endocrinology, for those who don't know, it looks at hormones. And so this is a pediatric endocrinologist saying, if you block puberty in children, you have no idea what you're doing. This is entirely experimental. And he's right about that. There's not a single long-term study on what the long-term consequences are for these puberty-blocking drugs. They were tested and FDA approved for treating the early onset of puberty, so that you would delay puberty to an age-appropriate time. And they're now being used off-label to indefinitely block puberty.
Well, we just had the case with the reality star Jazz, who has been on these puberty-blocking drugs and preparing for the transition. And so this is, I mean, you can find the clip, it's on YouTube from the reality show, and she's meeting with her doctors, and there's a problem because of the drugs, she doesn't have the tissue in order to do the surgery to transition to a male-type body. So, I mean, it's appalling to me because we're using young children as science experiments.
Yeah. And what that shows here is that because puberty was blocked, the genitals hadn't developed, and so there wasn't enough tissue there to do the reassignment surgery. But that doesn't even get at all of the other developmental changes that have been blocked. Think about all of the changes that happen to the human body in terms of your growth spurt, bone length, bone density, your weight, your musculature, your organ development. All of that's being interfered with. And they have no idea what the long-term consequences will be, because these are integrated developmental processes, and you can't just like hit the pause button. And so it'll be very interesting, but also probably rather tragic to see what are the health consequences long-term for someone like Jazz who hasn't gone through normal human development.
I want to bring in Father Scott and Carmen. I mean, you both have had more of a hands-on experience, I would say. Carmen, you teach high school students. I mean, we were speaking earlier, this is a topic that comes up all the time.
Yes.
In a lot of different ways. And Father Scott, you work with Courage, which, while that's dealing with same-sex orientation, it's not the same thing as gender dysphoria. There is some overlap. So just wondering if both of you could jump in from, again, that practical experience that you've had.
Practically, when the topic comes up in the theology class, you know, a lot of the students are very careful. Like they feel that if they speak the truth, that they're being unkind. You know, like we had one of the case studies in the book said, you know, imagine you're in a small group retreat and someone says, you know, I'm feeling this way. You know, what do you tell them? And a lot of them said, well, you know, it's like, I believe what you're telling. I was like, I think that's the truth, but I wouldn't tell that to my friend at that moment because they would be saying that I'm mean. You know, that somehow. But you know what I think, what you know, Ryan did in the book is that when you see the stories of those, you know, the ones that detransition and all that stuff, you see the mean thing is not to say the truth. You know, and that's what I tried to tell them. I said, but if you truly love your friend, you have to tell them the truth because otherwise you're setting them up for a life of unhappiness. And if you don't you want your friends to be happy? You know, like you know, if you want to be happy. And so you have to take them back to like, you know, stop thinking about what they're going to think about you, you know, and go back to, do you want your friend to be happy?
I mean, I think one constructive exercise of the many that could be taken out of this book is just to have a reading group over the third section, chapter 3, because that's where you go through all these tragic stories. And some of them I was familiar with, but not all of them. And I would just love to have, that to me would be a wonderful starting point. I like to think that we're objective when it comes to science, but still the emotions come in. Yeah. When you come to the personal narrative, we live in a world where the personal narrative trumps everything. And if we can have a conversation about those personal narratives, and as you point out in the book, not everybody that's transitioned regrets it, right? And the people who have detransitioned wouldn't necessarily agree with everything in your book, but they're telling a story that I think we need to pay attention to, and that's where I would love conversations to start.
And what's interesting about this is that for every media interview with Bruce, who then became Caitlin, you'll never hear an interview of Walt, who became Lara and lived as Lara for 8 years, and then went back to living as Walt. Right? The media won't cover any of the tragic kind of stories in this area. There'll be the Jazz Jennings specials, there'll be the Bruce Jenner and Caitlyn Jenner specials, and it's a very one-sided presentation. And so these are voices that have largely been ignored by the mainstream media, and sadly, many of them get attacked by transgender activists. So one of the videos is actually, it's a response to someone who was criticizing people who have detransitioned for being like self-loathing transgender people, right? It's like that type of an attitude. So I mean, they live a very tragic situation because they're taking criticism from all sides.
First of all, I want to thank you for coming, and Carmen, I think it's phenomenal that the Catholic Church is looking at these relevant issues as we are here today, kind of aware of the human condition, aware that these issues are occurring in everyday conversation, in the high schools, in colleges, in the media. And so I think it's extraordinary to see, thanks for organizing this, because it's necessary to look at what Pope Benedict XVI said, to give a yes, a bigger yes, and that bigger yes is linked to the truth. It's linked to the message that Jesus Christ has, which is relevant to everyone, especially those who, like you ended your presentation on, are suffering. And so whether it's a question of gender dysphoria, whether it's a question of like you had mentioned, courage, or you had mentioned anorexia, the human condition means that we have a heart that needs to be loved. And somewhere our perception of suffering has to come into the mix. I'm suffering at a deep level, and I have to be able to talk to somebody who's not going to suggest that I become a unicorn, for example, because what's to stop me from feeling like I really love giraffes, and I would just like, reassignment surgery to make me more like a giraffe, because it's coming eventually. This is just the first step. And
there are some trans species individuals. You can find pictures online of people who have transformed themselves into dragons and into birds.
And computers, people.
So I think it's essential that we begin to talk about these issues in the larger forum, that we offer a different message, that suffering can be redemptive. For instance, we always have Christ on the crucifix, on the cross, because it tells us something about God's love, something about our identity as priceless, that God loves each one of us as a son and daughter of God, and that means something. And so with the breakdown of the family, rather than just being stuck with sort of this extreme narrative, I think it's very useful. I like to refer to, if I may interject just for a brief story here, there's a Black American author, Nuruddin Knight, who came out with she was writing about a book. In fact, I'm going to look at my notes in the public discourse here, comparing kind of the trans experience with Toni Morrison's first novel called The Bluest Eye. It was about an African-American girl who longs to become a blue-eyed white girl. And she says this, and I'll go, if you'll allow me, I'll just read this really quickly. We as readers, says Nuruddin Knight, don't applaud this. We know that it's not really blue eyes that she wants. She wants something much deeper. Love, acceptance, respect, honor, the intangible human desires we all crave, but are not equally given, she writes. So then she takes it up to another level and says, but what if instead of wanting to be white, I wanted to be a man? What if instead of crying to my parents that I was really a white person, and this is an African-American woman writing, I told them that I was really a man and that I desperately wanted to change my body to match my mind? If in this scenario you think that my parents should applaud my courage, accept my new gender identity, and run to the nearest surgeon, please ask yourself why. And so I find it interesting how much pushback you've gotten, for example, by just referring people back to the truth. And it sounds so simple the way that you put it, and yet the challenge is there to be able to get the message of the truth out there. And I would be interested in asking you a little more about maybe if there are any initiatives to begin to, on college campuses, for instance, get this message out.
So the one college group that I know of that's working on kind of this issue and related kind of the outflow of the sexual revolution is the Love and Fidelity Network. And this is It has different chapters on various college campuses. They sponsor a conference each year at Princeton. They've had conferences at Stanford, and I've spoken at both places at their conference. And they were started as a response to the hookup culture, and then they started doing work on how to properly understand what marriage is, and they've sponsored lectures on gender dysphoria and the transgender identity claims. I would say the most challenging part on a college campus is to present this in a way, as Carmen says, that would strike people as being compassionate, because no one wants to be mean. Think about the bumper sticker, "Mean people suck." And they care more about being politically correct than actually being correct. So the way in which we present the argument has to be obviously coming from a place of care and concern for people, but then also it needs to be kind of like chock full of facts and figures and data and citations, so they know that there's good evidence. Because again, in our culture, the high priests are the doctors and the scientists. It's not the clergy.
One of the things that I like with the Theology of the Body, program that we use is that before it even gets to these questions, it sets the background for Genesis, the story, it's not the purple thing story, it's the right anthropology. And then right before it jumps into this, chapter 4 is on the fall and sin and redemption and Christ. So that you're coming into these topics with this idea that we're all fallen, and that there is redemption, and that no matter where you are on these things, that Christ has already died for you, and there's no reason to despair, which is, I think, when you read the stories, there's such a lack of hope, that's into this. I mean, how much despair do you have to be in to want to mutilate your body, and so I think you have to put it in that framework to start there. And in college campuses, I know some of them have done Theology of the Body, there's different for young adults and stuff, and I think it's so necessary.
I'd love to pick up on that because I have a couple of thoughts going through my head. So the Love and Fidelity Network, I've spoken at their conference, and one of the interesting things is that it's a group mostly of Catholic and evangelical students at different universities across the country. And so they really end up creating community for themselves because of the shared values. So there's friendship, but there's also the dating and romantic part. So there's actually, lots of relationships, wonderful marriages that are born coming out of the Love and Fidelity group. So they're getting from this group the friendship and the dating experiences and the romance, the things that should be happening at university. I mean, that's probably the best pool you're going to have in your life, generally speaking, for dating, but also for friendships and so forth. So all of this is happening. So it's kind of fun because you see them oriented on these ideals, but it's created a culture, right? And that culture creates a group for them. So sidebar, someone that I know that's involved in seminary formation shared with me that he'll have men who come to him in their first year or two of seminary, and they're in crises. They think that they're homosexual. And the reason that they do, as he drills down, is because they have never had a close friendship with another man, right? And so I just wanted to throw that out there because, first of all, creating an environment of friendship is supportive. That's where we can be vulnerable, but also the lack of that. It seems crazy to me that you have to find a Love and Fidelity group or some other specific group in order to create friendship. It's university. It should be fun. It should be a natural place where you make deep friendships that last a lifetime.
But the experience of a lot of men my age and younger is that you have drinking buddies and you have teammates, but you don't have that many close male friends.
Right.
Anthony Esselin, a professor, used to be at Providence College. Now he's at is it Northeastern Catholic? He's recently moved further up in the New England area, and I forget where he's now teaching. But he wrote an essay about a decade ago called "A Requiem for Friendship," precisely on how different it is for this generation of young men. Whereas every other generation, there were all these intense, serious friendships. In literature, Anthony Esselin's an English professor. Literature is chock full of these stories. And he was saying his students couldn't even identify with the protagonists in the novels because they didn't have firsthand experience of meaningful friendships like that.
Yeah, I saw the same thing in the classroom. This year I showed this video, And the video wasn't on that, but right after it says, watch next, and it was Father Mike Schmitz, and the kids is like, oh, let's put it on. And I put it on, and Father Mike talked about this, how there's no friendship anymore between same-sex friends, and especially between men, because of a culture that has so sexualized everything that if two men are good friends, immediately, oh, you're gay, like bromance or whatever, like immediately they're trying to, and so they're afraid, so I couldn't believe Father Mike, so I asked my class, okay, how many of you, do you have a best friend who's, a boy who has it? And none of the boys did. The girls did, but the boys just like, well, no, I tell my girlfriend, or I tell, and I'm like, okay, this is real.
So then you get to, for me, it all comes back to human anthropology. I mean, now we have a crisis in what it means to be human. If we don't have, those experiences of friendship, it's, aside from the family, either relationality first in the family, and then through friendships. And friendships are a very healthy preparation for whatever one's spousal or nuptial vocation is. And so we know that the family is a mess. And at the same time, now that people don't experience healthy friendships. So we're completely dismantling the building blocks, so to speak, whereby we learn to be relational. Yeah. Which then it makes sense that sex can be something that you determine for yourself. It's no longer relational.
And partly it's that we no longer have like the script of why do our sexed bodies matter in the first place, right? So there's a teleology here in which the boy is a potential man who's a potential husband and then a father, and the girl is a potential woman, a future wife, and then mother, and that there's a meaning and there's a purpose to why we come as a sexually dimorphic species, right? The sexual complementarity between male and female is what creates the capacity to unite as one flesh, as husband and wife, to then be mother and father. But so much of that's kind of been either explicitly or implicitly rejected.
Yeah.
Right? Whether it's with the redefinition of marriage or with contraception or with the hookup culture. And so now it just seems like it's an arbitrary fact that we happen to have male and female bodies, but we're not quite sure what the meaning of these male and female bodies are.
I was talking to two men in their 70s, and they said, when we graduated 8th grade, each one, they hadn't grown up together, they're friends now in their 70s, and they said, when we graduated 8th grade, we knew that if we wanted to get married, we needed to have a job so that we could support a wife and children. I mean, there are people who are 40 years old and don't know that now. So it's like the natural narrative, we don't have a narrative. So yep. People are writing their own narrative.
Yeah.
And I think this whole question is kind of showing us an angst in society. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but this the question of gender dysphoria is a pretty small percentage of actual, so then you've got the rest of society, which is sort of brought into the narrative through the media, through the changes in legislation and that kind of thing. So now we're legislating for a very tiny portion of society, but it manifests also a desire for entertainment. The reason that I think you mentioned, was it Walt? Yep. Who went and came back to Walt? Yeah. Because it doesn't sell commercials. It doesn't make any money. So the one that makes money is the Jenner and the other ones. So there is we've sort of fallen off the deep end with what is entertaining, what is entertainment. But at the same time, we're kind of brought along into this, well, what does make a boy or a girl? And these questions are being asked, also in the main scientific magazines and stuff, which is interesting.
And then I think culturally, you've seen that we've oscillated between two extremes on the, what does it mean to be a boy or a girl, between androgyny, right? And you can see lots of second wave feminists who were, more or less androgynous in their foundations. There are no differences between men and women that are meaningful. Everything's a social construct, right? So that's one extreme. The other extreme, exaggerated differences, like sex stereotypes. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus, as if we're so different that we're two different species. Where the truth is in between. Aristotle teaches that a virtue is the mean between to extremes. But it's very hard for most, especially young Americans today, to be able to articulate what that looks like, right? If they know that androgyny is misguided and these exaggerated sex stereotypes are misguided, it's hard for them to know, where does my masculinity or femininity make a difference, and how does it make a difference, and why does it make a difference? That's something that chapter 7 in the book tries to start to unpack and to spell out. But I found that was the chapter that had the least kind of literature out there. There's not much that's very good written on those questions. You see a lot of androgyny, and you see a lot of exaggerated sex stereotypes, and you don't see very much nuanced, careful reflection.
Ryan, do you think, because, as I was reading it, and they have all this, this minority, right, this trans, which are not that many people, and yet they're carrying all these policy changes and all these things. And I just wonder whether there's money, always follow the money, isn't how that saying goes? I mean, are the chemical companies, that are making these puberty blockers and all those things, you think they're trying to push, this agenda because, I don't know.
I don't know if the money is coming from the pharmaceutical companies so much as it is, I think, from the political. I would follow the power. And I think what happened was that no one on the left expected marriage to be redefined as quickly as it was. If you think back just 10 years ago, this state voted to retain the definition of marriage as the union of a man and a woman. So in 2008, California said that. And then it's 2015, so 7 years later, the Supreme Court redefines marriage for the whole country. And they had lost, the activists had lost vote after vote after vote. I think there were 31 states that voted on marriage, and all 31 voted to define marriage as a union of husband and wife. So as long as this was being decided by democratic politics, public opinion wasn't shifting. Once the court started redefining it, it accelerated the change in public opinion. But you had all of these existing LGBT activist groups who were now very well connected with the Obama administration. And they just won first the Windsor opinion and then the Obergefell opinion, 2 major Supreme Court cases. And that's why the timing is not at all surprising. 2015, the Supreme Court redefines marriage. 2016, the Obama administration redefines the word sex to mean gender identity. And that's when we got the Dear Colleague letter for the schools' bathrooms. That's when we got the transgender healthcare mandate. The activists pivoted from the LGB part of the acronym that people had been discussing for the past 30 years to the T part of the acronym, which most people had never had a conversation about. And so I think a lot of it had to do with you had very well-funded activist groups who were deeply connected to political power, and they got this done in that very last year of the Obama administration. And that's what set up lots of the cultural changes.
So before we open it up to Q&A, I just have one question for you.
Okay.
If you have an 8-year-old and you let them walk to the park alone, chances are someone's going to call Child Protective Services on you, right? But that same 8-year-old or younger, I mean, you gave examples of children as young as 3 transitioning. I mean, these are the same children that would eat ice cream all day if they could. They would eat chicken McNuggets exclusively. And yet, the high priests of our culture are saying
Cognitively capable.
That they are cognitively capable of making these decisions.
Yep.
I mean, I don't know, how many people have children, have been with children, and would you actually say that they are cognitively capable of making healthy decisions for them at that age?
And it's not just, I mean, so there's actually, if you step aside from the gender experts and you just look at neuroscience and psychiatry in general, there's a robust literature on how the human brain is actually underdeveloped to be making these sorts of decisions and choices.
No, seriously. I mean, you're supposed to help, what is it? You're supposed to help kids brush their teeth to age 6 or 7.
For the appropriate amount of time.
Because they can't brush their teeth by themselves. That's
right. But that's just, I mean, so this is just the literature that shows that with impulse control and the decision-making process of people under the age of 20 is just not very good because the brain isn't fully developed. But even apart from the fact that these young children don't make good choices, they also have no idea what it means to be a boy or a girl or a man or a woman. So it's not just that the they shouldn't be left to make these decisions, they're not mature enough to know what it is they're deciding about. Right? I was, probably a month ago, I was in New York City and I was speaking to a small group of young professionals, and during the conversation part, I just started asking them questions. I was like, what does it mean to be a man? And then I said, what does it mean to feel like a man? What does it mean to act like a man? And then the reverse, what does it mean to be a woman, to feel like a woman, to act like a woman? And they had no idea how to answer those questions. You know, they were asking each other, is this what it feels like to feel like a woman? How would I know if I'm feeling like a woman when I'm in a man's body? And do you both feel the same way when you feel like a, right? And what it elicited was that here you had 20-year-old, college-educated Manhattan professionals who couldn't answer these questions. How is a 5-year-old supposed to know what it is to feel like a boy or feel like a girl, to know that they actually are a boy or a girl? It's, to a certain extent, it's built on a house of cards. And one of the sad parts is how many casualties will they be when it falls in on itself?